everyone. I'm Major Garrett. Thanks so much for joining us. Beto O'Rourke is trying to break through a crowded field of 2020 candidates. The Texas Democrat is hoping to do that with a new policy proposal on Wednesday. Now, O'Rourke says he has a way to register an additional 50 million voters. My colleague, Elaine Quijano, is standing by with a former congressman for his first interview since unveiling that plan. Elaine?
Major, thank you. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. I know it's been a busy day, and I want to start with the policy proposals that you unveiled today. You have set a goal that some people might call ambitious, to have 35 million new voters cast ballots in 2024. How do you plan on doing that?
We're going to make sure that we bring everyone into this democracy. It's the only way that we're going to meet the historic challenges that we face. If we're going to make sure everyone can have access to health care so that they're well enough to lead their intended lives, or that they're included in this economy, or that we confront climate change before it's too late, this democracy is going to have to work. And right now it's badly damaged. So if we have automatic voter registration and pre-register high school students at 16 and 17 years old so that they're ready to vote when they're 18. If we have same-day voter registration, we can register over the next 4 years 50 million new Americans into our democracy. And if we have a voter turnout of about 65%, that means 35 million new voters participating, ensuring that their life experiences, their expertise, their perspective is reflected on these challenges and opportunities that we face. And if we complement that by making sure that we remove the obstacles. So here we are in Georgia, where we saw hundreds of thousands of voters purged from the rolls. In my home state of Texas, we have voter ID laws that keep people out of the ballot box, a new Voting Rights Act that ensures everybody has access to the poll, and then investing in voter election security to make sure that every vote is counted, taking big money out of our democracy, ending gerrymandering. We begin to get democracy that is reflective of people and is no longer captured by corporations and special interests and those who have the resources to pay for influence and outcomes. That's how we meet the challenges before us.
You've also called in this plan for term limits for members of Congress, so a maximum of 12 years for members of both the House and the Senate. Right. I'm just curious, how did you arrive at that number?
First, in terms of term limits, I think if we believe in one another, then we've got to believe that there can be someone who can succeed us in office, who will do just as good, if not a better job, than we'll be able to do. We have term limits for president. He or she can only serve 8 years maximum. Term limits for the mayor of El Paso, also 8 years. So we try to think about what's the amount of time needed for a member of Congress to be able to make a difference. 6 terms in the House, which is 12 years, or 2 terms in the Senate, also 12 years, should be enough to be able to confront those challenges that you were elected to confront, to move the ball forward on those things that you want to pursue, and then to get out of the way so that our democracy and our institutions are reflective of the people of this country. Right now, the full genius and diversity of the United States is not reflected in the halls of power. And I'll give you just one really great example. I served 3 terms in the House of Representatives, and when I left, the woman who succeeded me was the first woman elected to represent the 16th Congressional District in El Paso, Texas, and the first Hispanic woman to represent any congressional district in the state of Texas, along with Sylvia Garcia. Her name's Veronica Escobar. So she's the proof that term limits work and make our democracy better by getting better leaders into office.
You also say that Supreme Court justices should serve no more than 18 years. Again, I'm curious, how did you arrive at that number?
I want to make sure that when you have justices serving longer than ever, when the temperature is higher than it's ever been on nominations and the confirmation process, that we have some kind of regular turnover, especially given the issues that those justices will be deciding: reproductive rights, civil rights, voting rights, whether corporations have rights superior to naturally born citizens in our democracy. So I think having fixed term limits allows us to get the turnover that reduces the partisan temperature on these nominations and confirmations, and allows to make and ensures that we allow a more regular review democratically of this country's priorities from that third important branch of government.
On the Supreme Court, do you still favor expanding the number of justices potentially to as many as 15?
I don't know if that's the right way to address some really serious concerns we have about decisions that the court will be making. There's a proposal that would have 5 Democratic justices, 5 Republican justices, who would then elect another 5 justices. In my opinion, that further entrenches or enshrines the partisanship that we're seeing play out in the court right now. Instead, I think having term limits, which perhaps reduces the level of partisanship and certainly the anxiety and the bitterness of the discourse leading up to those confirmation proceedings, I think that can be even more helpful.
On the term limits, you're looking to do this through a constitutional amendment. How is it that you think you'll be able to get a constitutional amendment through? What you're talking about is essentially asking lawmakers to start running the clock on the loss of their own power and influence.
What I've learned is that lawmakers, before they prioritize anything else, they prioritize their own re-election. And that's why you have folks who stay in power, in many cases, for far too long, for decades. And what that means is that community, that congressional district of 700,000 people only has one face, one voice, one mind brought to bear on the challenges before it. But if that re-election is in part predicated on support for term limits, which is incredibly popular, and if we add to that those term limits will not begin until that constitutional amendment is ratified, meaning if you've already served for 12 years, once this is ratified, the clock will start at that moment, and you could have another 12 years going forward. So present company, to some degree, is excluded, or at least we don't count the time that they've already served against them. But this is an incredibly popular idea out in the country. Every town hall meeting where I listen to people on this issue, they want to make sure that there are term limits so that there's a more regular renewal of our democracy.
In your plan, you mentioned policies that you see as racist and discriminatory, voter ID laws, poll taxes. And in crafting your own policies in response to those, I'm curious what shaped your views on that.
Texas, my home state, ranks 50th in voter turnout, or at least it did before the 2018 election cycle. And it ranked 50th not because we love our democracy any less than anyone else, but we were literally drawn that way. Our state legislature drew people out of a congressional district solely based on their race or their ethnicity. It's not just me saying that. The courts found that to be the case in 2017. And so if we've in fact drawn people out and gotten to really terrible low levels of voter participation, then the answer to that has to be drawing people in, ensuring that more people are registered to vote through automatic and same-day voter registration, making sure that we remove obstacles like the voter ID laws that exist in Texas. You can use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are at the ballot box in Texas, but you cannot use your student ID at El Paso Community College to prove who you are at the ballot box. That, in effect, functionally shuts people out of their own democracy. So I'm inspired by the way that people have overcome these challenges in Texas, especially these students who overcame these racist voter ID laws to make sure that their vote would really count. But I want to institutionalize what we were inspired by so that no one has to overcome those barriers going forward and that they're automatically registered to vote. We make voting as easy as possible for them. And importantly, knowing that our democracy has been under attack from forces outside of this country, we invest heavily in voter security. We ensure that there's a paper receipt for every vote cast, and we audit our elections to make sure that the vote that you cast really went to the intended recipient. When we match that with everything else that we've proposed today, this democracy really begins to work again, and power is returned to the people.
So are the voices that you've been listening to on this, are they primarily the voices of the voters themselves, of students? Who is it? Who are those voices?
Absolutely. These are voters in my hometown of El Paso, in the other 253 counties of Texas, who understand that everything that we care about is on the line right now. Reproductive rights at a time that Roe versus Wade is under attack at the greatest degree since 1973, healthcare, climate change. And the only way that we're going to answer these challenges and overcome them is to make sure that everyone can participate. So people want to be involved. And I saw them overcoming these barriers that I've described in Texas and producing a voter turnout in 2018 that took us from 50th in voter turnout in the country to a state that is fully performing. We saw a near 500% increase in young voter turnout, in early voting in Texas. I won more votes than any Democrat has ever won in the history of the state. And we also won independents and 500,000 Republicans, showing that if you show up for everyone, everywhere, write nobody off, count nobody out, that you can do some really incredible things. And so I want to see that continue, and I want to make sure that those obstacles that people have described to us are removed once and for all.
So in this campaign, this Democratic primary campaign, the issue of identity is one that has been talked about openly. You've been very open about the fact that as a man who happens to be white, you have enjoyed certain advantages, and that people of color and women have had other experiences. I wonder how that knowledge or that awareness has shaped your decisions during your campaign, specifically with respect to the voices that you've surrounded yourself with at the national level, at the staff level there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it has forced me to make sure that I'm really conscientious about who it is I'm listening to, which communities I'm visiting, who's included in the conversation. As an example, I just talked to a young woman named Jessica Purnell today. She's a student at Prairie View A&M. This is one of those counties and voting districts that was gerrymandered, where voters were suppressed. She organized 500 students, primarily African-American, many of them African-American women, to make sure that they overcame these barriers and actually voted so that their voices are heard and their votes count. And I just called her to say, what more can I be doing right now? I want to make sure that you've read my proposal to fix our democracy. Is this in line with what you faced and what you want to see going forward? And from her perspective as a woman of color, she shared with me her excitement about her proposal and the need for us to make sure that we meet every single challenge before us with this same kind of urgency. Challenges that she faces that I will never know. For example, in Texas, we have a crisis in maternal mortality. It is 3 times as deadly for women of color, and it's happening as we have this attack on Roe versus Wade. Nearly a quarter of the family planning clinics in Texas have been closed down. It means that safe legal access to an abortion is much harder for women, and especially women of color. But it also means access to a cervical cancer screening or family planning help, or just being able to see a provider of any kind in a state that has not expanded Medicaid is made that much harder, especially in communities of color. So by listening to her and elevating her voice and her story, that informs the policies that I want to pursue for her and for this country.
In addition to voters, I'm curious about your own inner circle, though, with the campaign. Has that been a factor for you in considering who you've decided to bring on at the national level?
Absolutely. I want to make sure that my administration reflects the diversity and genius of this country. And I want to exemplify that in the campaign that I run to serve as president of the United States. So starting with Jen O'Malley Dillon, who is our campaign manager, Cynthia Cano, who is a key leader for us in the campaign, women and women of color, and people who represent the beautiful diversity of this country are represented as well in our campaign, informing the decisions we make, where we travel, and how we release the very ambitious proposals that we think will make this country so much better during our administration.
I want to ask you about reparations. I know it came up. You have committed to the idea of a commission to study the issue, but do you commit to the actual idea of reparations? Is that something that you would support? Why or why not?
I do, but I think importantly, that begins with a conversation that this country has never had. A conversation about the very foundation of this country, that America kidnapped people from West Africa, in bondage, brought them to this country where they literally built the foundation and the wealth and the potential that is still being expressed today in 2019, but which is not enjoyed by their descendants. There's 10 times the wealth in white America than there is in black America. We have gross disparities in access to education, the discipline within the classroom, the criminal justice system, and healthcare as well. So until we have that conversation and face the legacy of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and suppression, including in our democracy and who is allowed to vote, we'll never get to the underlying work of repair, which is at the root of reparation, nor will we discontinue visiting this injustice on future generations.
When you think about this notion, though, of reparations, what does that look like to you? What would that look like to you?
I don't know that I'm the one who gets to decide the answer to this question. I think we have to listen to those who've been disproportionately affected by slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and suppression. And that conversation really has to be a national one. There's an extraordinary piece of legislation written by Sheila Jackson Lee from my home state of Texas, which would impanel a commission to begin ensuring that this country has that national conversation about how we were founded, how wealth was built, and how it was shared and with whom it was not shared. Who has borne the brunt of a patently unjust criminal justice system? When we have that conversation, I believe the solutions will come into focus, but the conversation must precede any ultimate action or decision on an amount of money or to whom it is paid or what specifically it looks like.
I'd like to turn to some news of the day. Today, the Trump administration announced new restrictions on the use of fetal tissue for medical research. What's your reaction to that?
I think this is going to make it a lot harder for us to save the lives of our fellow Americans, to do the necessary research that will bring to bear the innovations that will help people who are today consumed by diseases for which there is no cure. This really important federally sponsored work taking place at universities across the country is the bridge for people who today are going to die from diseases for which we have no cure, and the cures that are being worked on in those laboratories. So this is an unfortunate decision, one which we would overturn in our administration.
On the issue of abortion rights, former Vice President Joe Biden says that he supports the Hyde Amendment, which bans federal funds for abortions. What is your response to that?
He's absolutely wrong on this one. The Hyde Amendment basically guarantees that lower income women and disproportionately women of color will not be able to access their full reproductive rights, health care, safe and legal abortion. As president, I will make sure that we repeal the Hyde Amendment and roll back the gag rule, which prevents doctors from being able to make the best possible referrals to their patients, in many cases for the health and life of the woman involved. We've got to make sure that when we're talking about universal, guaranteed, high-quality health care, we're talking about a woman's right, and every woman's right, no matter their income or zip code, to make their own decisions about their own bodies.
Would you support Joe Biden knowing that he backs the Hyde Amendment?
I hope that Joe Biden rethinks his position on this issue. Perhaps he doesn't have all the facts. Perhaps he doesn't understand who the Hyde Amendment hurts most. And again, it's lower income communities of color. I would ask that he rethink his position on this.
A new Quinnipiac poll out today found that 60% of Democrats in Texas and people who lean Democratic actually would like you to challenge Republican Senator John Cornyn and to end your presidential campaign. What would your message be to those Democrats?
First, I would tell them that I am incredibly grateful for all of the support that they gave me when I spent 2 years running for Senate, visiting every one of the 254 counties of Texas. An extraordinary campaign, and it was really driven by the people of Texas. No PACs, all people from every single county. There will be some really wonderful candidates running against John Cornyn in the Democratic primary. One, MJ Hagar, has already announced a combat veteran, an extraordinary candidate in her own right. I have every confidence that she or one of the other contenders will be able to take on John Cornyn and prevail. Right now, I'm running to serve as president of the United States and to make sure that at this polarized moment with a president who seeks to divide us further every day, in a democracy that is badly damaged, that is desperate for the repair that we need, that I bring a life's work of bringing people in and together and making sure that this democracy works for everyone to the challenges that we face. I believe only by doing that can we defeat Trump in 2020 and bring this country together again in 2021 around the challenges of climate, our economy, healthcare, immigration, the crisis in student loan debt. We cannot meet these challenges by half measure or by half step or by only half the country. I want to bring everybody into this. And that's always the way that I've served, and that's the way that I'm campaigning right now.
But what does it say to you that even after having done all that work of traveling to all of those counties and meeting all of those people, that still 60% of these Texas Democrats want you to end your presidential campaign?
I think they want to see Texas represented by someone in the United States Senate that reflects our values and the urgency with which we want to bring to the greatest challenges we have ever faced. And I'm a known quantity. I went to every one of those 254 counties. Probably there's a good chance I met the people who were interviewed or questioned in this poll. I think when they get a chance to meet some of these contenders like MJ Hagar, they're going to be very pleased and know that it's not about a candidate. It's not about any one person. It's about that movement that we got to be a part of in Texas. And that movement still exists, and it will be there to ensure that we defeat John Cornyn.
On the topic of Texas politics, would you support Gina Ortiz Jones against Congressman Will Hurd in the 23rd District?
I will very likely support the nominee in that race. I'm a big fan of Gina. She may have other competition, so I don't want to put my thumb on the scale in that intra-party race. But should she be the nominee, I will be supporting her.
Because last time around, obviously, it was a razor-thin margin, 926 votes.
Right, yeah. No, we need to maintain the majority, increase it if we can, in the House of Representatives. It's a little bit of a different scenario for me now. I'm no longer a member of the House. I no longer have a day-to-day working relationship with colleagues and friends, and Will Hurd is a very good friend across the aisle. But the challenges that we face and the fact that our democracy is under attack by our very president, who involved who welcomed the involvement of a foreign power and who sought to obstruct the investigation into what happened. This is on the line, and I want to make sure that there are people who are willing to stand up to this president when we must. And I know that Gina or whoever the nominee is will be able to do that.
The issue of climate change, as you know, is critically important to many voters. Your climate plan calls for the U.S. to reach net zero climate emissions by 2050. Some say that's not an aggressive enough timeline. Is it possible your timeline is off?
I guess anything is possible, or let me put it this way. If there is a more ambitious, more aggressive goal that we can achieve, I am all about it. And our plan says we will reward states who get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions before 2050. If they need additional federal resources, if we need to be flexible in our permitting or investing in innovation, we will do it. So 2050 is the backstop. If we can get there sooner, we absolutely will. I will note that our plan gets us halfway there by 2030, which is a little bit more than 10 years. And we get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions on federal lands by 2030. That means no new oil and gas leases on federal lands, and existing leases are not extended and will be forced to reflect the cost of pollution and their contribution to climate change. In addition, we're going to put farmers in the driver's seat, so more land left in conservation easements, more incentives to plant cover crops to capture more carbon out of the air. And we're also going to do sustainable ranching and grazing. It's a much more effective, efficient way to produce the food that we need and much friendlier for the environment. So I feel good about how ambitious and strong our plan to confront climate change is. If there's any way to be more ambitious, believe me, as president, I will be.
So your fellow candidate, Washington Governor Jay Inslee, says that the Democratic National Committee is not hosting a climate debate and says the DNC told him, quote, if we participated in anyone else's climate debate, we will not be invited to future debates. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm really grateful that Governor Inslee is in this race and that he's making climate his signature issue. And I think whether he is successful in the nomination or not, he's going to be an important contributor and leader on this issue going forward. And I think this idea that given the fact that climate is the most important challenge we face, if we don't successfully confront it in these next 10 years, and that's really all the time that we have left, then the fires and the droughts and the floods that we see today will pale in comparison to what we see going forward. So having a debate solely focused on this makes a lot of sense. I want to be respectful of the DNC and the fact that they have to manage 24 candidates, or maybe there's more by now.
But Democrats deserve to have a full debate on this issue of climate change.
So the answer is yes. Again, I'm glad he's calling for it. I think it makes a lot of sense. I'd love to find a way that the DNC can incorporate this idea into their debate process.
On immigration, the president plans on imposing a 5% tariff on imports from Mexico starting June 10th and could possibly go as high to 25% if Mexico does not do enough to stop illegal crossings. You are from El Paso. What do you think the effect of that would be?
This is about the dumbest idea economically that this president has come up with. There are 6 million jobs in the United States that are connected to U.S.-Mexico trade. 40% of what we import from Mexico actually originated on U.S. factory floors. So by setting a tariff or a tax on what we import, we're actually taxing ourselves and we're undermining those 6 million jobs here in the United States of America. And it will do nothing, absolutely nothing to address the root problem, which is that some of the most violent countries on the face of the planet are unable to protect their citizens, and they're willing to flee 2,000 miles to come to the U.S.-Mexico border to seek asylum. My plan calls for no new tariffs on Mexico to ensure that we strengthen that trading relationship to the benefit of our workers and our economy, and that we invest in the challenges in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, reduce violence there, address the historic drought in Honduras, perhaps using the expertise of United States farmers to ensure that people don't have to make that journey and don't come to this country where today they're greeted by walls or cages for their kids or deportations for their parents. This is a really bad policy, economically, morally, any way that you look at it.
So what you're talking about, though, with the focus on Central America would seem to be sort of a longer-term solution. In the near term, you have, for instance, today, the Office of Refugee Resettlement announcing it is moving to end funding for recreational activities, including soccer and even English language classes, because they say they need to address the humanitarian crisis that's happening now. What would you do in the short term?
So, first of all, I wouldn't punish these kids for doing what any human being would do faced with the same choice. You know, if you were to remain in your home country and be killed or pressed into service in a murderous gang, or you could flee to the United States, what would you do, or what would any of us do? So the wealthiest, the most powerful country on the face of the planet, a country that is comprised of refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants from the world over, certainly has the resources and the tradition and the self-interest to do the right thing. So let's get the Office of Refugee Resettlement within HHS the resources that they need to make sure that these kids can get an education, can spend some time outside. Let's use a program that I've proposed, the Family Case Management Program, so that you don't have to keep them in detention at all. When they work with a case manager, they show up to their court dates, they make their appointments with their ICE officers, they follow our laws, and they do so at 1/10 of the cost to detain them. So this is humane, this is effective, this is efficient, this is great value for the U.S. taxpayer. At the same time, let's invest in resolving the root problems that have caused people to flee in the first place. President Trump wants to cut all funding to Central America. That will exacerbate the problem and force more families to flee the United States. I want to reduce violence there by investing and working with other countries in the region. That's the best long-term strategy to address this problem.
Our time is running short. Very quickly, what are you looking for in an ideal running mate?
Oh, I'm looking for someone who reflects the ambition and the aspiration and the genius of this country that I'm seeing everywhere that I travel. Folks know that this is a defining moment of truth for us. And they want to stand up and be counted. They want the responsibility and accountability that comes with that. I want a leader who reflects and represents all of that. And I want a ticket, and in the future, an administration that looks like this country. Make sure that every child knows that no matter their race or their gender or how many generations their family have called America home, they could be president or vice president of the United States of America and bring whatever they have lived in their lives to bear on the great opportunities that we have as a country.
You're meeting with Stacey Abrams on Thursday. Can you tell us what that meeting is about?
So Stacey Abrams is one of my all-time heroes. The way that she met a fraudulent election where the Secretary of State, the umpire, was also one of the contenders. The hundreds of thousands purged from the voter rolls, voting machines that didn't work, lines that stretched hours long. She really should be the governor of the state of Georgia right now. But the fact that after her loss, She used the attention that she had garnered, the respect that so many of us feel for her, to focus on voting rights and to make sure that everyone is included, every vote counts, and every voice is heard. She's somebody that we should all be listening to right now. So I'm going to meet her to listen and learn from her.
2020 Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Major, back to you in New York.
Elaine, thank you. We're going to take a quick break. Red and Blue continues. You are streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.